Signore e signori, buonasera. Welcome to New York University, Casa Italiana, Zereli Marimo. My name is Stefano Albertini. I'm the director, and it's a great pleasure to present this book here tonight, House of Secrets, The Many Lives of a Florentine Palazzo. And we have the fortune, of course, to have with us the author, Allison Levy, that I'm going to introduce in a minute. But this palazzo is also something that has a place in my heart, because a few years ago, as every summer, I went to Florence to teach and direct for the NYU summer program there. And the cab driver left me in front of this thing. And I didn't know where I was going, because it was a last-minute reservation that I made, and the agencies always give weird names to the apartments that they rent you. And I realized that he left me in front of Palazzo Rucellai, that for me, studying Machiavelli, teaching Machiavelli, was this mythical thing that nobody could access. I was actually living there. I would be living there for 6 weeks, and I did. Not to mention the fact for what used to be a young boy from Mantova, for whom the name of Leon Battista Alberti was like the paramount genius of all times, that then the Florentines stole back from us. It was a sort of reappropriation also of the memory of Alberti by living in the palace whose façade, as we know, he designed. I was very happy just with these two things. But somebody like Allison Levy, who has both the skills, the intelligence, the determination of the historian and of the detective, wanted to dig a bit deeper in that charming place, loaded with history, tradition, stories, and much more. And the result is this absolutely fascinating book, incredibly well written, beautifully researched. And we have a fantastic panel to help us present it. So I'm going to introduce Allison now, and then after her presentation, that it will include some iconography, some images that are going to be very helpful for you to understand the entire thing. I'm going to introduce the members of our panel that will join us on the stage to talk with Allison about House of Secrets. So Allison Levy is an editor and an art historian. She's the digital scholarship editor at Brown University, art historian educated at Bryn Mawr College, and she taught at University College London, Wheaton College, and Tulane. She has published widely on early modern Italian and Europe, and serves as general editor of the Amsterdam University Press book series, Visual and Material Culture. Please welcome Allison Levy.
Thank you, Stefano, for that very generous introduction. It's truly an honor to launch House of Secrets here tonight at Casa Italiana with all of you, so many colleagues and friends, and a very esteemed panel helping me to present the book. So it should be a fun evening. So House of Secrets is a book about memory and desire. It's about the stories that structures hold and the stories that we invent to fill those structures. Far from another architectural history, certainly countless tomes have been published on Giovanni Rucellai, or his architect, Alberti, especially. Rather, House of Secrets offers up a character-driven historical narrative of Palazzo Rucellai. Over the course of 6 chapters, one for every century the House of Rucellai has persevered, the disparate yet closely linked lives of those enmeshed in the history of the house amass, presenting a single portrait of the edifice itself. We will meet Alemanno, a 13th century ancestor whose discovery of a precious dye, nicknamed Poor Man's Purple, gave the Rucellai family its name, literally, from Orlicella to Rucellai. Of course, we meet Giovanni Rucellai, the patron of the great house, and his architect, Leon Battista Alberti. and of course learn how this house was constructed. Giovanni Rucellai famously wrote in his diary, "From 8 houses I made one." So he called in Alberti to attach a façade, to put a strong public face on his physical and emotional labyrinth. We will meet Giovanni's sons, Pandolfo and Bernardo. This is Bernardo with his new bride, Nannina de' Medici, in a commemorative marriage print. I love, yes, I love the role reversal here. So we have a buff Bernardo as the mast of the merchant ship, and a very ornately dressed Nannina directing him. Much is known of their wedding. It was a very much the event of 1466. It took place over 3 days in the piazza in front of Palazzo Rucellai. And we know so much about it because Giovanni Rucellai kept meticulous notes about the dowry, about what Nannina was bringing into the family, into the palace. But we know less about this couple and what they did after the famous wedding. So in the book, I take the reader along to some of the country estates and a Rucellai garden where they entertained in very exciting ways. And Paolo Rucellai, so this is one of Bernardo's sons, and in that garden that his father developed, cultivated, he oversaw the dissection of a monster in the early 16th century. He described this as a monster. Today we would refer to that monster as conjoined twins. So there was a lot of gore in the family properties as well. Moving into the 18th century and early 19th century, the book explores the ways that the family sort of hold themselves up within the palazzo. It was a very long 18th century in Palazzo Rucellai. This is a Mariana Rucellai, early 19th century, another marriage portrait. So this was painted to commemorate her marriage to a gentleman from Bologna. I like to think that she's sort of thinking about her ancestor, another Rucellai woman of the 18th century, who is rumored to have hurled herself into the courtyard on the eve of her wedding, and that is Bianca the ghost. It is indeed a haunted house. And the 19th century, when the Rucellai family has to open up the house to residents, renting the rooms of the palazzo. And this is Henry Layard, the English archaeologist who spent his childhood in the home. His father was a diplomat in Florence, and they rented the piano nobile. And at this time, we also see an influx of art dealers, of people interested in buying, and of course of old families needing to sell. And this is an altarpiece by Filippino Lippi that was in the house and is now in the National Gallery, London. And in Layard's memoirs, written at the end of his life, he remembers with very vividly his childhood in the palazzo, and he writes about a fight that he had with his brother, and one of them threw a shoe, and it hit the frame of this, and he claims that he could still see the dent in that frame when he visits the altarpiece that once hung in his bedroom, but now in the museum in London. And we meet a very another colorful, eccentric character, Lizina Rucellai, who married into the family in the very early 20th century and moved onto the piano nobile. So the Layard family left, and the Rucellai reclaimed that very important level of the palazzo. She was a twice widowed Cossack countess who was famous for her friends. Let's see. This is her cousin, Felix Yusupov, fabulous cross-dresser who also happens to be the self-proclaimed famous assassin of Rasputin. And after the Russian Revolution, he is trying to survive in exile, sells the Rembrandts, but ultimately has to sell his mother's jewels, the diamond earrings that once dangled on the lobes of Marie Antoinette. They're now at the Smithsonian. But before he found a buyer, he visited his cousin Lizina in Palazzo Rucellai, and he had these tucked into his pocket. She couldn't afford to buy them, of course, but they eventually went to Pierre Cartier. And she was a dear friend of Harold Acton. This is Harold Acton at Villa La Pietra, his estate in Florence. He was a little bit younger than Lizina, and she was sort of a tutor for him, a social tutor. She was well known for her tango teas and her private parties with D'Annunzio. And Harold Acton writes about this, and Lizina writes as well in her memoir, which is a little-known text that was an invaluable document for me. And Tayat, the futurist artist who presented his tuta, this egalitarian unisex jumpsuit, in the, I think it was the summer of 1920, he presented this again on the piano nobile of Palazzo Rucellai. So just one of the more festive events that happened in the house, and then an unfortunate incident that happened as recently as 1997. This is Alvise de Robilant, the Venetian nobleman who was living in Palazzo Rucellai and was brutally murdered in the house, living in a third-floor apartment, and that crime remains unsolved today. So, there is a second narrative that also runs through this book, and that is the story of my own residency in Palazzo Rucellai. A year of living with ghosts, a year of walking in footsteps, a year of sharing a space, a structure that shapes lives but also survives them. And so I'm going to read from that personal narrative for the next 20 minutes or so to give you a sense of what my residency was like in that house, and particularly as an art historian, my coming to terms with moving into a house that I thought I knew, only to discover I did not at all, and maybe I didn't know myself as well as I thought also. So the book opens with me, a burnt out assistant professor of art history, very happy to finally have a sabbatical, to spend a year in Florence, to write a book on tomb sculpture. And so I was looking for what I thought might be the perfect apartment, and I stumble upon an advertisement. The description was discreet. Living room, bedroom with stone fireplace and wood beam ceiling. Antique terracotta floor. Fully equipped kitchen, bathroom with tub, tastefully and elegantly furnished, third floor with elevator service located in the famous Palazzo Rucellai. I had to read it twice to make sure it wasn't a figment of my imagination. For this wasn't just any building, this was the structure that started it all. Centuries of conoscenti had idolized the palace, and rightly so. Palazzo Rucellai was the first private building with its groundbreaking façade to establish the vocabulary of Renaissance classicism. I, by comparison, had worshipped the palace a mere 20 years, ever since that fateful semester back in 1987 when, as a newly declared art history major, I enrolled in a seminar on its architect, Leon Battista Alberti. So only 20 years, yet my devotion could hardly be paralleled. I knew the palace intimately. That is, I knew it as well as any art historian could know it. I'd even seen it in person quite a few times, each visit a transcendental experience. From the far corner of the tiny piazza opposite the palace on Via della Vigna Nuova, I would stand transfixed. Without fail, Palazzo Rucellai, on my every pilgrimage to Florence, delivered exactly what I was looking for, or rather, what I'd been trained to look for. The 3 stories of imposing yet accessible height, divided by 2 friezes intricately carved with family emblems, the pilasters of varying classical orders, an application echoing the elevation of the Colosseum in Rome, the bold cornice, at once crown and temper, bestowing grandeur and gravitas in one broad stroke. All there. Nothing superfluous, nothing unexplained. It had come to serve as a sort of confirmation of the rule, this checklist, a reaffirmation of my faith in art, beauty, and the ideal. With its promise of deliverance, the façade of Palazzo Rucellai continued to beckon, and I, ever faithful, never ceased to heed the call of its architect, that, quote, one's gaze might flow freely and gently along the cornices, through the recessions, so that anyone who saw it would imagine that he could never be satiated by the view, but looking at it again and again in admiration, would glance back once more as he departed. That's Alberti. Because I'd always lingered longer than was necessary, I knew too that the stones blushed at sunset, and that the cornice wept during torrential downpours, that only 11 of what had once been 14 torch holders remained hammered into the 7 window frames on the piano nobile, and that each and every one of those wrought iron rods cast upon the golden façade at high noon a grim shadow, a temporal stain resembling a noose already taut around a traitor's neck. And the glass panes hanging within those gallows, I'd observed long ago, shook with every passing city bus. Far below, the built-in bench accommodated an ever-changing huddle of Florentines, wearily awaiting transport elsewhere. I'd perched on that pockmarked surface myself, not waiting to leave, but rather wishing to stay. Reclining on the hard, unyielding seat until my shoulders awkwardly attached to the cool sandstone, I would slouch there and stare out into the piazza before me, breathing in the building at my back as the cellar exhaled moist air against my dangling ankles. On one such occasion, glued as I was to the façade, I turned my face parallel to the palazzo and noticed that a certain T. Bartlett had left his John Hancock to the right of the main portal in 1868, and that that same door, not surprisingly, was lacking a knob. I even knew what the palace looked like on garbage night, the only time this handsomest of façades appeared at all compromised. But I'd never crossed the threshold. I'd never even tried, because for me, Palazzo Rucellai had always remained a venerable exterior, a massive wall of sandstone there to be admired at a remove. The palace was still in family hands, after all, closed to the masses. End of story. Until, that is, I fell upon the Contessa's advertisement. A week into my stay, I was still tripping over the impedimenta of the nobility. It was a far cry from the anemic housing I'd had as an academic. Suffice it to say, I was living large among orphaned heirlooms, quietly nestled upstairs in a repository of Rucellai disinheritance. To be sure, the apartment had been aptly named, but Archivio stored more than just cast-off furniture and chipped china. It was also, I began to perceive, a guardian of secrets, a keeper of memories, a confidant who had heard it all. As an outsider invited in, I found myself living between floors, between centuries, between lives. Or so I mused when I should have been unpacking my books. As I was the sole tenant, Nico the porter had let this slip on day 2, I'd been enjoying myself immensely, having effectively the run of the house. Nico lived there also, but only Sunday evening through Friday evening, and he slept in an alcove just off the courtyard. Well past retirement age, the guard was safely tucked in every night by 8 p.m. That's when, as a morgue-like hush fell over the palazzo, I would roam the halls, knocking on blind archways, daring the ghost to wake. I took great delight in swishing down the marble staircase, bowing to battered portrait busts of adopted forefathers at every dusty landing. I even took the liberty of sorting through the family mail, which still passed through a slender slot carved to resemble a foreshortened Roman sarcophagus, or, I thought, a parted mouth ready to speak. Though I knew that Florentines had long made a habit of recycling family names, standing there in the vestibule, fingering a certain Giovanni's correspondence, took my breath away. I also went behind the scenes and between the walls. I drew back curtains in quarters that were not mine to enter, enjoying views of the city that only Rucellai eyes, I like to imagine, had taken in. And I discovered in a rear corner of the piano nobile, tucked not too far from a tiny rectangular chapel, a disquietingly narrow spiral service stair, which ran, unilluminated, from the tip-top of Palazzo Rucellai to rock bottom. Adding to the sense of peril was the absence of a central solid axis. In lieu of a supporting pole, let alone a railing of any sort, with a brittle rope knotted at regular intervals and suspended some 70 feet. With steady steps, I began the ascent, my left hand tightly grasping the knuckles of the fiber pendulum as my right hand trailed flatly along the enclosing wall. I didn't manage to complete a single revolution before I seized up with fear. If the Contessa found out. Rather than lose my footing in the dark, I returned to the front of the palace and jimmied my way into the ballroom. I entered easily enough, only to discover that the enormous square room with its white-on-white wedding cake styling was already occupied. Gamboling overhead was a gaggle of gauze-draped maidens in varying degrees of undress. I kept my head cocked back for a good 5 minutes, titillated by the risque fresco, its sensuality heightened by a sorbetto-tinged palette. Perfectly besotted with these rococo beauties, I floated up to join them on top of the world. Enchanted, I remained. What was I looking for, breaking and entering my way through Palazzo Rucellai after hours? There was the novelty of the address, undeniably, that I now possessed a key to the front door of Alberti's magnum opus exhilarated me. But my stealth meanderings through the house weren't merely of an academic nature. There was also something achingly personal about my movements, the way I fingered the mail, for example, or the way I cupped doorknobs, even the way I sank into and petted the upholstered furniture. All of these gestures betrayed a dire and unapologetic covetousness on my part. For what I'd finally found in this house, I believed, was my home. After a full day of luxuriating in Palazzo Rucellai, I geared up to leave the building. Even from the ground floor, no fewer than 3 locked doors stood between me and the street. And these weren't just any locks. They were 300 years older than the Liberty Bell, with a set of hopelessly unwieldy keys to match. This antediluvian mechanism of simple warded lock and crude bit key offered minimal security and maximum stress. It took longer for me to exit the palazzo, for example, than it did to zigzag to my favorite enoteca, an elegant wine bar tucked away in a ground floor room, just off the courtyard of a family palace to rival the one I was living in. We go way back, this venerable Florentine house and I, their entry-level blend having been my weekend read of choice throughout graduate school. Though no enophile, I knew that the family had been making wine for just about forever, and it came in the most handsome bottle on the Chianti shelf, the label an engraving of a Tuscan villa set within a formal garden of cypress, olive, and clipped boxwood, the perfect house red for an Italian Renaissance art historian in the making. Then, years later, on a trip to Florence for dissertation research, I made the link between the winery and this family palace and began drinking in situ. Now, as a professor with a cushy fellowship, I could even afford to take an occasional meal here. On my first night back, Francesco, the perfectly seasoned manager, standing squarely behind the wood and copper bar, its semi-matte countertop handsomely scarred by decades of bottle dings, slowly began to polish the bright surface in front of him. When he asked where I was living, I assumed he'd be impressed by my reply. Palazzo Rucellai. Why on earth would you want to live there? As Francesco poured, I proceeded to summarize for him the merits of Alberti's architecture. But still he was unpersuaded, less of my lecture on the façade, it seemed, than of my decision to reside behind it. Vediamo, he said with a wry smile, we'll see, and slipped into the kitchen. We'll see what? I wondered. I took a long sip and began to swirl. Did this layman know something I didn't? The next morning, indulging my curiosity about the palace's local reputation, spurred by the prospect that there just might be something more to Palazzo Rucellai, I headed out, reader's cards in hand. So I throw myself into researching the history of Palazzo Rucellai, voluntarily losing myself in the house, seeking out the old world at every turn. And before long, I found myself mingling with a social set that was not my own. This included what I might today describe as a romantic misadventure with a Florentine nobleman. So I pick up the story here about halfway through my sabbatical. I continued to see Lorenzo, my own Il Magnifico, though we rarely met in Florence. Instead, I would take the second-class regional train over to Pisa, then down the coast to his winery, from where, usually after a bubbly lunch al fresco, we'd depart, flying as far from Italy as his turboprop could take us, Dubrovnik, Paris, Vienna, and innumerable points in between. For the Grand Renaissance Commander, yes, that was the actual name of the aircraft, the Grand Renaissance Commander required no more than a 3,000-foot landing strip, or, as Lorenzo called it, a runaway. Indeed, I'd spent the majority of the fall semester running away with him on short notice, and my passport had the hastily made impressions to prove it. Mauve and gray smudges from over-inked stamps, haphazardly hammered down, quickly accumulated on the once spare light blue government pages, paying no mind to delineated boundaries, blotting out any trace of my former life as a commercial flyer. I had other travel trophies too, these of shiny brass and nickel, Cunha, Florent, and Lay. I kept the foreign coins in little felt pouches from Prada and Gucci that had once held extra buttons and care instruction cards. I'd been spending what was left on my stipend on clothes and accessories, well, more suitable for palace life. For Palazzo Rucellai had finally acknowledged my presence, albeit in fickle ways. The house was often indulgent, coaxing me into the courtyard on silent nights, enticing me to run my hands over its girdled columns. Other times it was decidedly uncharitable. One Sunday afternoon, returning home after a lazy lunch at Camillo, my key broke as I was extracting it from the lock on the second set of entry doors. Knowing I'd be going out that evening, I propped open the uncooperative threshold with a brick. When Nico got home and read the explanation I'd left for him, his reprimand made even the house shake. He threatened to report my breaking of house rule number 1 to the Contessa, but upon realizing that he too would have hell to pay, settled on a firm finger wag and a gruff retreat into his alcove. Figuring I ought to lie low for a while, I tried to refocus on my research. It was bad enough that I deserted my sabbatical book project altogether, but the fact that I'd taken a hiatus from my house homework was starting to gnaw at me. My cherished library visits had grown few and far between, and I wasn't the only one to notice. At the bar in Piazza San Marco, where I'd regularly down a cappuccino before heading up to Itati, the barista asked if I'd been in the US. And in the reading room, I noticed on my first day back, my Wi-Fi password had expired a month earlier. At the Kunsthistorisches Institute, my unofficial locker had been taken over by an ambitious graduate student, and my tessera glared with more blank squares than stamped ones. I'd missed several lectures at Villa La Pietra, and half a dozen email requests for letters of recommendation from my students had gone unanswered. I was determined to get back on track. Soon enough, however, I found myself newly distracted. On the occasion of my upcoming birthday and to commemorate my Florentine period, the Marchese commissioned a portrait of his professor. Having spent the first half of November plotting, I was finally ready to sit for my portrait. On the face of it, donning royal purple, given my address, seemed apropos, but where, at the dawn of the 21st century, could I possibly find a garment dyed with oricella? Instead, I decided, as a specialist of widow portraiture, I should wear black. A subtle nod to the academic life I'd somehow ended up putting on hold and was slowly letting bleed out. The painter was an American expat, approximately my age, who'd established himself in Florence 15 years earlier. His passion was plein air landscape, but he earned a living by making his noble patrons appear noble. His studio was located in Piazzale Donatello, just north of the Old English Cemetery, about a 30-minute walk across the centro from Palazzo Rucellai. Initially, I enjoyed my mornings there immensely, but the excitement of posing soon waned as the process dragged on and genuine melancholia set in. Sitting stiffly in the studio for weeks on end, breathing in the heady fumes of linseed oil and turpentine, I thought at length about the art of painting, about subjects, and about surfaces. Which self was I projecting, and which was I concealing? As I sat in my Prada weeds, I couldn't help but think of Virginie Gautreau, the eccentric widow from my native city, New Orleans, who, through John Singer Sargent's scandalous gaze of 1884, had become Madame X. What, midway through this sabbatical, had I become? A blank slate, a black hole, Professoressa X? And what did Lorenzo want with a portrait of a professor anyway? Though my surname outdated his by millennia, I couldn't see him hanging my image on one of his walls. An academic among the aristocrats? But then again, as much as Lorenzo prided himself on his portrait collection, it probably could use an original. Historically, non-partible inheritance law, still the norm among the Florentine nobility, kept the contents of a palace in place. By this practice, Lorenzo's picture gallery likely consisted of copies of paintings inherited by his brother. Perhaps then the presence of an art historian would help to authenticate Lorenzo's art collection. Yet aside from that, what would this patrician gain by grafting an American professor onto his rootstock? I began to wonder if Lorenzo's generous commission was less a validation of me than of himself. So I am now toward the end of the personal narrative, and I'm writing about a weekend in the Maremma. The main event organized for Saturday morning was to be a wild boar hunt. Though the hunting season had long ended, cinghiale had become a big enough nuisance that authorities turned a blind eye to what was, in reality, at least in Tuscany, a year-round practice. But this was a moot point, considering the expansiveness of the family's collective property. Gunshots were seldom heard by anyone other than the hunting party. I was hoping to witness this Tuscan ritual, but Lorenzo decided that I would go out riding with Fiammetta, his 7-year-old daughter. Never mind that I'd never been in the saddle. Beginner that I was, I'd been paired with Milkshake. Just my speed, I thought. But before we'd even hit the main trail, the very naughty pony threw me straight into a massive mound of Mediterranean macchia. It was all a blur of sand and shrubbery, and as I lay supine, in a state of psychosomatic paralysis, I entertained myself with fantasies of being medevaced to the nearest hospital in the family chopper. Clearly, that wasn't meant to be. Before long, the trainer had somehow managed to get me on my feet, calling ahead to alert the staff there'd been an accident. Back at the house, my requests for medical care appeared DOA. Lorenzo was furious that news of my fall had delayed the start of his hunt. Khalid will go to the pharmacia, no farther. I spent the rest of the day propped on a plump chaise in the Marchese's private salon, satisfactorily sedated with a steady drip of vino rosso and unsatisfactorily patched with analgesic bandages. Kamal and Elisabetta, members of the household staff, had positioned my bruised body against a glorious ground of Ottoman embroidery. Hand-woven for Marchese, I was told, with silk thread by little old ladies in Uzbekistan villages. Lorenzo's sense of colonialism at the dawn of the 21st century was by now thoroughly discombobulating. Though I had the luxury of contemplating this facet from a cushy perch, my uncertainty about where he saw me in the great conquest made me only more uncomfortable. Nor was the tapestry of grouse and boar trophies in the room exactly helping matters. Looking around at this display of corpses and then down at my own, I could only wonder what sort of appetite was being satisfied here. That evening, as the clan gathered for dinner, I took my assigned seat, my rigid posture determined as much by the kink in my back as by the red-clawed wolf embossed on every plate, glass, and napkin within sight. Most of Lorenzo's cousins I'd met on an earlier trip to Hungary, thus I was well aware of their penchant for barzellette, Listening to their jokes, spoken in an arcane dialect, exhausted me. I simply couldn't keep up. Imagine my delight then to find an unfamiliar, mature face directly to my right. The interest was reciprocal. So, Lorenzo tells me you're a professoressa. How wonderful. And you're living in Palazzo Rucellai. He says you're writing a book. Before I could confirm all of the above, the doyenne turned to Lorenzo and asked, sotto voce, does she know about Alvise? He winced, and I nearly choked. As I downed a healthy dose of rosso, she leaned in and whispered to me, don't be a chiacchierona, eh? There's nothing there. Had the Contessa just chided me? Fairly sure the mouthful meant a gossip, I thought it best not to ask for a translation. And what exactly was meant by that grim addendum, there's nothing there? I quickly turned to the junior equestrienne, hoping she might redirect the conversation. Alas, having parted ways with Milkshake, I was no longer idolized by Fiammetta, and she too was ready to pounce. What are the colors of the Levi? Months earlier, I would have told her simply that my family didn't have colors. Now, up to my ears in the trappings and toxicity of the old world, I replied, yellow. She held my gaze blankly. Our emblem is the star. Fiammetta exclaimed, I love stars, hearts and stars. As the little girl cooed, the doyenne honed in on me and divulged, very pointedly, Lorenzo has never loved anyone in his life. Everything's a lie. It's called good manners. For my final reading, I turn to the final chapter in the book and the biography of Alvise de Robilon. On April 30th, 1956, the 31-year-old nobleman married the 25-year-old American model Betty Stokes, said to be one of Emilio Pucci's favorites. The newlyweds settled down in Grottaferrata on the outskirts of Rome, and on February 3rd of the following year, Betty gave birth to the couple's first son. A few months later, Betty's friend from Lexington, Virginia, the abstract expressionist Cy Twombly, traveled to Italy to be with her. Some 50 years later, Betty reflected on their friendship and Cy's summer sojourn in Grottaferrata. I met Cy through a mutual friend in Lexington. I had just graduated, and we got on like hotcakes because we were interested in the same things. We talked about art together, and our aesthetic was the same. From then on, we would go for picnics and go swimming together, and so on. In 1955, I went to Italy working on a modeling job for a magazine, and I thought I might want to stay in Europe, that I could maybe go on to Paris and London. I'd never been to Europe before, but instead, I got stuck in Rome. I had got married in Rome, and I came back on a visit to New York, and that's when Cy said that he always thought I was going to marry him. In 1957, he stayed with us in Grottaferrata. There was an extra room, and he lived with us for a short time. We had fun. He'd go up every afternoon and get ice creams, and so on. We were like brother and sister, really. He set up a studio, and he did paintings in that place with us. I don't remember all of them. There was a lot going on then. Cy took several photos of a postpartum Betty that summer. In one especially moving portrait, Betty stares out of a window, her left hand flat against her heart, her neck protrudes, as though longing to connect with something beyond the room. Yet her eyes appear glazed over. Her face betrays not a hint of a smile. Betty at the window, cornered, stuck. 10 years later, Twombly, now fully settled in Rome, would paint Betty's husband and now father to 3 sons. Portrait of Alvise de Robillant of 1967 is one of a series of 7 nearly life-size portraits that Twombly made of a group of friends from his earliest years in Italy, which included Paul Getty and Giorgio Franchetti, the latter an early champion of Twombly's work and eventually his brother-in-law. And this is Franchetti. Alvise invited my sister Tatiana and me to a luncheon at a country house that he had rented. That was how we met this young artist, who was very elegant, very handsome, very aloof, but actually highly emotional. After lunch, he showed me the drawings he was doing, and I was dumbstruck. What an intensity, like an electric current. They were obviously charged with such power and mental vibrations that I received the message. Twombly's early intensity had only amplified by the time he portrayed his now 41-year-old friend, de Robillant. Using oil-based house paint, graphite, and wax crayon, Twombly created a multi-layered, monochromatic abstract rendering of de Robillant. The only indication of the sitter's identity is his name, scratched in large, loose letters across the top of the canvas. The figure is composed of nervous lines, frenetic attempts at obliteration, erasure by marking, swift, spontaneous gray hatching against an off-white impastoed ground yields visible pentimenti, a compromised tabula rasa. De Robillant's is a painful portrait, unrecognizable, violated, raw. Pulsating like an electric current, Twombly's painting of 1967 eerily foreshadows his friend's vicious murder. For exactly 30 years later, this vision of a destroyed de Robillant would be fully realized. Twombly's pictorial prophecy aside, what happened to Alvise de Robillant on the night of January 15th, 1997, remains within the walls of the antique Palazzo Rucellai, as the press reported. Indeed, this house, both witness and accomplice, will never tell. In the aftermath of my riding accident, I thought differently about de Robillant's murder. His body, abused and abandoned, once lay just on the other side of the plaster wall I now sat facing. Had he felt the first blow? What had gone through his mind? Had he felt the second or even the third? Had he seen it coming? Had there been time for regret? As I stared at the stone and plaster membrane that separated the crime scene from my apartment, trying to disentangle truth from fiction, I realized that the more intriguing mystery was not so much who had killed de Robillant, but who had died there. For it is precisely such uncertainty that defines the man and his murder, the inability to ever know the tenant on the 3rd floor. Though our residencies didn't overlap, I felt a certain consanguinity with the departed de Robillant, both of us subscribing to the belief, like so many before us, that the palace is a place of opportunity, a place where identity can be assumed as desired, 2 tenants with much to gain and maybe a thing or two to hide.
The chairs. So while our students set up the chairs, I would like to introduce to you the rest of our panel tonight that is going to help presenting Allison Levy's book. So we have Leonard Barkin, who teaches in the Department of Comparative Literature, and he's also has appointment in the Departments of Art and Archaeology, English and Classics at Princeton University. Leonard was also here at NYU. Actually, he's one of the first people I met when he was visiting, and I thought, wow, this must be a great university if they're all like him. Soon after, I discovered that it was not the case, and even soon after that, he left for Princeton. And if I have to give you a definition that might sound trite, but it's the closest thing you can get to a Renaissance man today in America, because his interests are not limited to Renaissance literature, art, and archaeology, but include food and wine that he pursues in a very methodic and scholarly way, as very much as he studies everything else that he studies. His upcoming book will be entitled Reading for the Food. Is that correct, Leonard? Art, Literature, and the Hungry Eye. Please welcome Leonard Barkin. We have then Gerry Milligan, who is a professor at the College of Staten Island, CUNY. He's director of the college honors programs, and his research interests include the Italian Renaissance literature, gender studies, and women writers of late medieval Renaissance Europe. And he teaches courses on medieval Renaissance literature and culture. His latest book that he presented here not too long ago with Professor Cox is Moral Combat, Women, Gender, and War, published with Toronto University Press in 2018. And finally, we have Alexandra Stille, who is São Paulo Professor of International Journalism at Columbia University, graduated from Yale with a BA and a Master of Science at Columbia. We were also fortunate enough to have him on the faculty here in the Italian department at NYU, too shortly, unfortunately. Alexandra writes regularly for the New York Times, La Repubblica, The New Yorker, the New York Review of Books, the New York Times Magazine, The Atlantic Monthly, and many more. Some of his book titles became legend, like Benevolence and Betrayal, Excellent Cadavers. His latest book that we present is also on this stage is The Force of Things, A Marriage in War and Peace, published with Farras, Ross, and Giroux in 2013. Please welcome Gerry Milligan and Alexandra Stille. And we decided that it's going to be Gerry go first.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I've prepared some remarks. I like to speak. It's easier for me to read. But I do want to say that I'm so pleased to be here, Allison, and thank you for inviting me to share this stage with the stellar panelists. I think, judging from how many people here, I can say that it's telling how compelling your story is and how much people like you. So I'm really excited to speak. And I want to start with a personal note. I've had the pleasure of getting to know Allison over the last 5 years. We met at a conference here in New York. And what I remember about our first meeting is that I immediately felt an affinity with her. We both share an interest in masculinity and gender in the Italian Renaissance, and we both happen to be Southerners. And Allison's New Orleans roots figure frequently throughout her book, and I really enjoyed reading how she draws associations between her childhood experiences in New Orleans and her adult encounters in Florence. She shows how Southern conventions that regulate the demure behavior of women are neatly reflected in the high society of Florentine aristocrats. And I'd actually go one step further and say that modern culture in the American Southeast shares much with Renaissance Italy. Though separated by 500 years, both cultures place a particular emphasis on decorum, beauty, propriety. And in both cultures, these elegant aspects have a darker side, where propriety is undergirded by violence, decorum is policed through social surveillance, and beauty is a precarious facade that's defended at all costs. And in her book, as you've probably seen, Allison disrupts the beautiful spectacles of Florence and exposes that darker side sometimes. She tells us how, as a young girl, dolls and dresses gave her hives. And she says it. And she also shows us how, as an adult, being forced to become a doll in a dress by an overbearing Italian paramour became equally as unappealing. I think it's appropriate that you're in a dress in the portrait and not tonight. I like that. The excitement for the reader is to watch how Allison enters into the dollhouse of Florence and removes the facade stone by stone so that we can all peer in. And the resulting narrative is a real page-turner, and I just couldn't wait to find out what was behind the door around the corner or see what scene might be painted underneath the lid of a wedding trousseau. I also couldn't wait to learn more about my friend who, in writing this book, invites us behind her own facade so that we might understand her experience of living within the pressured rules of high society, and better yet, what it feels like to break the rules sometimes. So what I'm going to do now is spend just a minute or two talking about 3 themes of the book that struck me, and then ask Allison to reflect on those for us. And I'll limit my portion of the presentation to the Renaissance, because I'm sure my fellow panelists will have much to say about other aspects, but I really want to talk about the jumpsuit if we can at some point. The first point I'd like to make is about Rucellai's relationship with the architect of the house. The book makes a provocative gesture by placing the figure of Giovanni Rucellai alongside his architect, Leon Battista Alberti. The 2 men, Allison claims, shared an experience of trauma. And this is something I hadn't really thought about the 2 of them before. But both had lost a parent at an extremely early age. And in the case of Alberti, he was further traumatized by the fact that his family prevented him from receiving any of his inheritance on his father's death. Both men, it would seem, had much to prove. Among his many self-promoting acts, Alberti famously added Leon, which of course means lion, to his birth name. I think we should all consider what animal we want to add to our name. And he cast, if you recall the picture, she placed it on the screen, he cast his self-portrait in bronze, wearing a Roman toga and a haircut in the shape of Julius Caesar, in the style of Julius Caesar. Now, Rucellai, on the other hand, threw himself into money-making and real estate development. And he desperately wished for and funded a palazzo, or at least the facade of one. And he paid for the marble facade of the neighboring church of Santa Maria Novella with a tax fraud scheme. But it was his move of inscribing his name across the top of the church in gilded letters that really speaks to a bloated ego projection. And I have to say, reading that fact, I couldn't help but connect his ego with a certain modern real estate developer who has a penchant for his name in gold letters on buildings. But in Alberti and Rucellai, Allison rightly finds this kinship of trauma, and it would seem that they also share a kinship of anxiety, an anxiety to prove themselves as men worthy of recognition. The second theme from the book I'll mention is how the buildings relate to masculinity. Alberti tells us in his dialogue, The Books of the Family, that the head of the household should be as a spider at the center of a web, standing at the ready to scurry out and fix any problems that can occur. But this spider man is pretty anxious. He's fairly anxious. He must, Alberti tells us, make certain that he always pays attention to how he walks, how he speaks, how he dresses, how he rides a horse when he's in public. Alberti further tells us any father must stamp out effeminacy in his sons, and he must train his always younger wife so that she won't even desire to deceive him. Now, Rucellai also wrote a tome that contained advice on how to raise a family. And Allison's book inspired me to head here to the library at NYU to consult his notebook, or the Zibaldone as it's called. And it's a collage of texts, partly in Rucellai's own words and partly quoting famous authors from antiquity on various subjects. And interspersed among the lessons on raising a family, he also makes long, enumerated, somewhat dry lists of his belongings, such as the clothing he gifted his daughter-in-law, who was from the wealthier and more famous Medici family. Now, Rucellai's notebook may seem to be a private diary, but as Allison shows, he was always writing for posterity. And if he's attempting to show himself in control, we can also see an anxiety in his prose, where he seeks to demonstrate that his wealth was on par with the Medici and that his knowledge was comparable to a learned humanist. My final point is to simply ask, who were these wealthy one-percenters of Florence? When I read that Allison paid her rent to the Contessa Rucellai, something struck me as strange. I didn't remember the Rucellai having a noble title, so I did a little digging. And in fact, the Rucellai, like the Medici in the 1400s, were rich, but not noble. Only in the 1870s did the King of Italy bestow the title of Count on the Rucellai. Now you might ask, what does it matter whether these corrupt, wealthy power brokers had a title or not? And I think that when we speak about masculinity, it does matter, or it can matter. And again, Allison's book leads me to this thought. She has the reader consider the ways these men projected a common man masculinity that may not have been possible had they been noble. In both the Medici and Rucellai, the head of the family, the pater familias, touted a middle-class masculinity from his gilded throne. Today, we might call this a false populist strategy. Giovanni de' Medici advised his son Cosimo to look like a common merchant and avoid ostentation. Don't ride a horse, ride a donkey. This is the Medici. Now, Rucellai, too, as Allison explains, does something similar. When Giovanni Rucellai nearly goes bankrupt during the financial crisis of the 1470s, he reminded his family that they were merchants and that they should act like shopkeepers. Now, of course, he never stopped flaunting his wealth, but the rhetoric of the common shopkeeper must have held some cachet in a city of merchants. So in conclusion, I'd just like to say that Allison's book really inspired me to think about masculinity and wealth in new ways. And it also gave me some insight into how the elite had co-opted the common man image, and how all of these parties would utilize this narrative to gain control and influence, and in the Medici's case, control the city. And it's just one of the many ways that this book, it's one of the many ways that the book is both Renaissance and modern. So, Allison, I hope it's apparent how much I really enjoyed your book, and I think everyone should get a copy. So thank you for that. And I'm going to ask you 3 questions that you're going to have to now memorize and hold till we finish. But it's a challenge. But all right, let's go for it. So the first one is, you spend a good deal of time translating a fascinating poem of Frotola that satires the luxurious cosmetics and clothing of Nannina de' Medici. That's Bernardo Rucellai's wife. The one in the ship, you might recall, with the, the fabulous husband. Despite the luxurious life she must have lived, she famously says, "Oh, do not be born a woman if you want your own way." So, of course, you also note that when her father-in-law, Giovanni Rucellai, records his family tree in this wonderful notebook, he leaves out all the women. Now, this struck me because when we think about the Medici family, we've seen so many studies on the important roles of the Medici women. And of course, Lorenzo de' Medici famously stated that when his mother died, he lost the only person in the world he could turn to in times of trouble. So, my question is, what are your thoughts about these Rucellai women? Are they exercising the power and influence that we might see in the other families? And feel free to discuss your Contessa, who you paid rent to. I'm curious about her. My second question is much shorter. Thank goodness. What do you think we've been missing all these years when studying Palazzo Rucellai? What part of the guidebook should we rewrite? And the third question is that one of my favorite moments is actually a modern moment. It's when you state that, that the Renaissance architecture throughout Florence gives a certain authenticity to the knockoff Prada and Gucci bags that are being sold on the street by the street vendors on the sheets. I love that thought. And the difference between buying a knockoff Prada bag there versus Canal Street, for example. It was interesting, I thought. But you note that that same architecture allows for the street vendors to hide in the dark corners when running from police, which is a terrible scene if you've seen it. But it seems to me that Palazzo Rucellai, with its thin facade covering medieval houses, seems a bit like a palazzo struggling to not be seen as a knockoff. I wonder if you have any general thoughts you'd like to share on this tension between authentic and false that came out in your research. And I also wonder if you think that the Rucellai family ever arrived at an authenticity, or if this is just an unobtainable construct. So that's it.
Thank you, Gerry. I think we're going to hear the comments and remarks of all the panelists, and then you're going to... you want?
Maybe at the end.
Yeah, so we're going to... Yeah, perfect. So we're going to go with Leonard now? Okay. Yes.
Well, I have to begin by, first of all, saying what a pleasure it is to be back here. So many happy memories, both sitting up here and sitting out there. So it's a great privilege to be back. So with that in mind, I have to begin with a terrible confession, a confession I ought not especially to make in this building, and certainly not in front of Allison Levy. I don't really like Florence. I really, really don't like Florence. It's very ungrateful of me not to like Florence. I had an extraordinary, nothing compared to Allison's, but I fell into a spectacular apartment in 1980 in the Via degli Alfani, spectacular in part because the people who owned it made a really pretty good sort of B-plus Chianti called Riecine. And many years later, as I was just reminiscing, Nick and I fell into amazing house called Casa Moril, which used to belong to Itati. So I've lived very grandly in Florence. Florence has afforded me extraordinary scholarly chances. I spent many days fingering Michelangelo's pieces of paper when I was working on Michelangelo's life on paper. Nevertheless, I have trouble with Florence. I find those streets that are so gorgeously adorned with Renaissance palaces very dark. I find the tourism overwhelming. We were there in the winter even then, and there were many more people shopping on Via Tornabuoni than wanted to get into the Accademia, but maybe that's a good thing. And I'm always troubled by the fact that in Florence when they say si va a casa, I think they're talking about Yiddish for pig. And the only memorable experience I've ever had under the Tuscan sun was the fact that there was a balcony in the Via degli Alfani, and I got sunburned in the summer of 1980. All of which is to say, however, that you don't have to love Florence to love this book. It's, of course, a consummate guide to the urban center of Florence, far beyond, indeed, the walls or particulars of Palazzo Rucellai. But I found the book even more inspiring for a couple of scholarly reasons. Though I don't want to get too pedantic about scholarly. After all, the book is a kind of love story, various different loves involved, or a sex story, and it's also a kind of what Italians call, in their language, a thriller. Oppure un giallo, sì. So the first reason for this kind of this real satisfaction I find as a scholar, reading the work of another scholar, is that humanist scholarship over the last 30 or 40 years has cultivated an intense sort of skepticism, questioning, problematizing, as we say. So the reading of great works of art, whether literary, visual, or any other medium, has been churned through every possible form of doubt and suspicion. The one thing that all these scholars don't investigate with their suspicious eye typically is themselves. Who is it, I ask, who is telling me how to read this book or how to understand this picture or listen to this music? So I embrace with greatest enthusiasm a work like this one that is poised precisely between fascinating works of art on the one hand and an extraordinarily open and introspective portrait of the person who is showing me these works of art. The second reason is also a reflection of a certain fatigue on my part with the habits of professional scholarship. Even after decades of celebrating interdisciplinarity and even intermedial scholarship, and here I'm thinking of my own field, which I share with Allison, of Renaissance studies, this kind of study remains very segmented. In this book, Allison has found a dream object for desegmenting the past. She is writing about a building. Not, of course, only as a piece of architecture or architectural history, though she does that with great professional skill, far more than I possess, because, as I often say, in my studies, architectural history was just too butch for me. But rather, you might like that. But rather, understanding a building as a place where half a millennium of life and art, love and hate, riches and decay, politics and passion have been lived. That is to say, as a place where all the arts of art and arts of life have been expressed and produced. Well, the whole story of Allison's book is based on a powerful conceit. As old as the Odyssey or as familiar as Alice in Wonderland, our heroine emerges from the narrow confines of the world of American college faculty. We'll overlook for the moment, as I know from her reading her CV, her editorship of Sesso nel Rinascimento, Pratica, Perversione, Punizione. It's not that sort of narrow a background. And she is permitted by a set of improbable, yet also very ordinary circumstances, a sabbatical long domicile in Leon Battista's extraordinary, or he's the facade maker anyway, 15th century Palazzo Rucellai. She has not the whole of the structure, of course, at least she's not supposed to, but a little space called the archivio. And she's under fairly heavy pressure not to exceed the bounds of her assigned space within a Renaissance palace, but almost immediately, and in several different ways, she does. And she becomes a kind of traveler in a strange land. And what a land it is. The Palazzo Rucellai turns out to be everything and plus. And the book shares that everything with us generally. We learn about, and some of these things Allison has already recounted better than I can, but we learn not only about the color purple, so to speak, but the necessity of urine in producing color. We learn about, of course, Lorenzo il Magnifico, non quello de Medici, and I particularly want to pull out the notion that he's a direct descendant of Ugolino. If you give some thought to the Canto 33 of the Inferno, that becomes a little creepy. But anyway.
Because he cannot be a direct descendant.
No, I don't think so. That's sort of the point of Canto 33. He is the possessor of an ancient family winery. That's when I got interested in it. We learned obviously about Alberti himself, a master of infinite fields, plus someone who also, like Allison, wrote about himself or herself. And all his self-glorification, which makes him quintessential uomo universale, and which Allison, I think, rightly refers to as inflated sense of self, a new term for Renaissance man. We learn about Brunelleschi in the picture plane, the vagaries of Renaissance real estate, the research opportunities of the Berenson Villa. And I particularly love the marvelous evocation that Allison does of what it means to stand literally in front of a real work of art, not in front of a digital reproduction. And so I feel at times that it's as though Walter Benjamin's aura is being revisited here by someone with a passionate aesthetic sense that is several degrees hotter than Benjamin's, which you might say doesn't take much. But I loved coming to friends of mine, Boccaccio, Botticelli, and the story of Nastaggio degli Onesti, which is indeed a bizarre wedding present. And both the provenance and the passion seem relevant, even though most of the art is in the Prado, but who's counting? And certainly her educing issues about sex positions in the Nastaggio degli Onesti of Botticelli was not lost on me. I love 3 pages of trousseaus. I love hearing about Savonarola and the hitherto forgotten, at least by me, Medici Nanina, si chiama. We already saw the necropsy of a monster. I also learned the word necropsy from this book. And the portrait, naturally. As we know, the inevitable virgin suicide, the noble duelists fighting over a prostitute, and then a turn toward the Anglo-Saxons. Other nationalities appear, a Middle Eastern princess who wants to amputate the top floor of the palazzo and ship it home. GHL, I assume is involved. But they lose things, so I'm glad that didn't happen. And of course, we end with the murder of, as we've heard of, Albizzi di Robilon, said to be the handsomest man in Italy, which turns out to have been an opinion shared perhaps by too many people for his own good, of too many of the 12 possible sexes. But I want to end where Allison ends, with something quite different from all this. It's not Florentine, though it may have something to do with Alberti. I don't think anyone seriously considers that, but anyway. No grand palazzo is involved, nor any long genealogy of powerful Italian nobles. As Allison's story comes to an end, she sits down and reads this book. In fact, she is stuck in an elevator. It's a crazy book written in a more or less made-up language involving a passionate dream of desire, called the Hypnotomachia Polyphili. It was published by the great printer Aldo Minuzio, who lost a fortune on it because no one could understand it and therefore no one bought it. Nowadays it's a little different. Copies of that original edition fetch $600,000-$800,000. Allison has among the purchases that she's assembling, as she contemplates the return from the dream of her own, a 19th century copy of this dream of Polyphilo. And as she sits in the immobilized elevator. She reads and recounts for us this story of a fantastical epic of desire. I'm delighted that I share the love of that book with Allison. And her own book makes me fully understand what it might mean to experience such a voyage with Allison in Wonderland. Thank you.
Thank you, Leonard. And we have now Alexandra Stille.
Hi. So I'm the one non-scholar on this platform. And
You're
so
a full professor at Columbia University.
that's just an illusion.
We won't quote you on that.
Well, as been pointed out, titles are open to interrogation and suspicion, and they help one get through this life, but they often have other surprising things behind them. So I came at this book as a non-scholar and a non-specialist in Florence. Having spent more time in Rome and Milan than Florence. So my reading of it is that of an ordinary reader, which might be that of many of you here. And I can just say as an ordinary reader, it was a real pleasure to read. I read it. There are not too many scholarly books that you read from beginning to end with pleasure, waiting to get into the next chapter. Allison, I think, did a wonderful job in producing what you might sort of describe as a hybrid kind of book that combines, as you've already gotten a flavor from her own reading, a personal first-person memoir together with a scholarly book on this remarkable palazzo and its history. What is nice about it is that it works very well, and I think very cleverly, to bring you into the scholarship which is there but worn very lightly in the book. But in fact, the descriptions you heard her read of the palazzo then actually prime the reader, I think, very effectively to want to know more about, so what is this palazzo? How did it come to be? What is this family that's occupied it? And so it works very, very well. And so, curiously, as I was anticipating being here, I highlighted a series of passages. And interestingly, given that I'm the non-scholar in the group, I ended up flagging a number of passages, which almost all have to do, actually, come out of the scholarly parts of the book, because there's just an enormous amount of really fascinating history, social history, in the book. And since Allison read from the narrative portions of the book, I thought I would just share with you some of the things that I flagged that I found of great interest. One of the things that I think she does very well as a scholar is to latch on to the really interesting nuggets of historical fact that really bring you into the time. So among the ones that I flagged were no more than 1 in 8 Florentines had a surname in 1347. And although there would be a steady increase in the adoption of family names, the percentage of households using a surname in the first quarter of the 15th century hovered just around 35%. So that gives you an idea of this medieval world that's only very gradually evolving into a world where identity is somewhat closer to what we're used to. And so the idea of having a palace that would bear the family name, you can understand then the importance of the names. Another interesting thing, so powerful, in fact, that these complexes become, these are the buildings of private palaces, that already by 1250, city officials were pressed to pass legislation limiting private tower height. Anyone caught adding to the resultant stumps would have had both hands amputated. And this, I think one of the things that is a recurrent theme in the book is the tension between the desire on the part of people like Giovanni Rucellai and his descendants to affirm themselves through by showing off their wealth and power, and then at the same time the restraint, knowing that this is an era in which one shouldn't estimate social envy is a huge factor in life. In fact, even if you go forward in time to the 20th century, reading Fontamara of Silone in this village, the guy showing him around talks about the importance that everyone feels invidia, that it's like the driving social force, that anyone who's getting too big, too important is immediately become the object of. And so you see that here where she writes, Leonardo Bruni extolled the homes of private citizens, which were designed, built, and decorated for luxury, size, respectability, and especially for magnificent. Even if I had 100 tongues, 100 mouths, and a voice of iron, he wrote in his panegyric of the city of Florence, I could not possibly describe all the magnificent wealth, decoration, delights, and elegance of these homes. But, as she then writes, so splendid was Palazzo Medici, for example, that an angry neighbor threw a bucket of blood onto the facade in protest, an incident indicative of the pulse of the Popolani and colorfully recounted by the anti-Medician chronicler Giovanni Cavalcanti. And so, again, you see this tension between the desire of a newly rich city to express itself in the form of beautiful palazzi and the tensions that sometimes creates. You mentioned the 1%, but there is kind of that sentiment operating here. I love the specificity of the book, for example, where she writes, it is estimated that the median cost of a palace was between 5,000 and 10,000 florins, approximately the entire capital of two very large wool firms. To put this cost in further perspective, Brunelleschi earned 100 florins per year as foreman of the Duomo. And there's a lot of specificity, again, in describing the transformation of Florence between 1450 and 1478. Some 30 palaces were built in Florence. So that puts the creation of Palazzo Rucellai in a larger perspective, where you see the city that many of us have visited is actually really taking shape during this period. Wonderful is the whole description around this extraordinary Medici Rucellai wedding. You saw the picture of Nanina and her husband. And clearly this was, as people understood, marriage to be at that time for somebody like Rucellai, who was a nouveau riche, who was had made it. He wanted to codify that making it with a marriage into the wealthiest, most powerful family in the city, namely the Medici. And you get an idea of what this meant. You noticed Allison mentioned, I think, that the wedding takes place for 3 days outside, not inside the palace, but outside in the street, so people can see it and to some degree participate in it. She writes of one of the participants, he had a garland of feathers and pearls made, which cost 80 florins, and the headdress underneath has two strings of pearls costing 60 florins or more. When she goes out, she'll have more than 400 florins on her back. And he ordered some crimson velvet to be made up into long sleeves lined with marten, for when she goes to his house, it was unusual for the groom or his family to outfit the bride to such a degree and such a cost. She was, after all, his prize, a commodity to be dangled in front of a sensation-hungry audience. There's some wonderful passages on Alberti's thinking as architect. I love the fact that he is so conscious of the actual practical aspects of the architecture. He writes, for example, that each room should, of the marriage, a couple, husband and wife, should each have its own separate bedroom, but each should have its own door, in addition, a common side door to enable them to seek each other's company unnoticed. So very important. And with equal practicality, he writes that the kitchen should be neither right in the lap of the guest, nor so far that dishes intended to be served hot become cold in transit. Those dining need not only be out of earshot of the irksome dun of scullery maids, plates, and pans. Take care, he continued, that the dishes are carried along a route that is protected from the rain, has no tortuous corners, and does not pass through any dingy place, all of which may compromise the standard of the cuisine. As she writes, this extraordinary expenditure of money over the palace and then the wedding ends up contributing to the ruin of the family briefly during the financial crisis of the 1470s. So that one sees, again, at many points in this history, that all of this wealth, all of this display of power, there's always a kind of uneasy element to it, to know that it can be taken from you. Many of the characters end up either in exile. There are some beheadings along the way. It's, as anyone who knows Machiavelli knows, this was a tough world where the price of loss was frequently death or dispossession, and that's something that haunts the inhabitants of this house and hangs over, I think, the story even as you move forward. And then the difficulty as Florence recedes in economic importance, the inhabitants of the house have greater difficulty in keeping it up in the style to which it was created, and they end up selling off pieces of it, renting out parts of it. So you have that story. The other thing that I'll just sort of end on, which I think is nice, is that the narrative she creates, where she weaves together the personal narrative, her own year in Florence, together with her history of the building, ends up, I think, working very nicely, because the story of the other Lorenzo, Il Magnifico, the vintner, with I guess actually a genuine noble title that goes back a little further, is somehow in harmony with this larger story, because in a sense what you get, the gradually emerging portrait of him, is also about possessions, and in a sense you got a taste of this through the last bits that Allison read, that his own life seems to be one of a series of acquisitions and possessions in which love, for example, doesn't really have a place, because love and acquisition are different impulses. And so, in a sense, her love affair with him, which ends up failing, is in some way a kind of metaphor for her ambivalent relationships, perhaps, and maybe you can address this as a question if this is an overinterpretation on my part, of a certain ambivalence as well about the Rucellai and their own overreaching and their obsession with their things. So that was, to me, I thought the book came together very nicely, and it was the two strands of the personal and the historical come together very nicely. But it's an extremely satisfying experience as a reader, and I recommend it highly.
Thank you very much, Sandro. And now we have tested you as a narrator, as a scholar, and now your memory skills, whether they're up to the standards of mnemotecnica del Rinascimento.
Okay, I will do my best. Well, thank you all for such thoughtful questions, for reading the book so carefully, and I'm glad you all enjoyed it, and enjoyed your remarks on the book, and thinking of how I can sort of tie all of this together. I will try to answer specific questions as well, but I think I might start off by revealing that the original title of the book was Palace Complex. This is new, courtesy of my publisher, and I think House of Secrets works beautifully. But as I was writing this book, from the time that I had the idea until now. When this was a Microsoft Word document on my laptop, it was entitled Palace Complex because I think my subtitle was a psychobiography of Palazzo Rucellai, which I think also points to some of my graduate coursework and training at Bryn Mawr. And so that's how I approached this house, one of the ways I approached it. And certainly still, all of the characters in my story, and myself included, have a palace complex of some sort. They're, it's very much a story about how we project our own ideals and fantasies onto buildings and make demands, in this case of Palazzo Rucellai, and how Palazzo Rucellai does or does not cooperate and give us what we want. And as I was living the personal story as I was writing the book, so that slowed me down a little bit because I wasn't quite sure what was going to happen next. But and I didn't know what exactly this personal narrative would look like, but I did know that I wanted to explore in great detail the many lives that played out in Palazzo Rucellai before I entered. And so as I was doing that research and writing that history of characters from the 14th century forward, particularly when I was writing about Giovanni Rucellai and this the house, as you know, it starts off with his father's very modest medieval two-story townhouse. It's from that corner that he spends 30 years buying up property. So location was everything to him. He had the money to start from scratch, to build up, but he had to start with his father's house as the anchor, as the emotional cornerstone. And so as I was thinking about, well, what is Giovanni Rucellai's palace complex exactly, or to go deeper into that, I quite often just would stop and think about a conversation I had recently had with Lorenzo, who certainly had a palace complex. He's the youngest son, and so did not inherit a part of or any of his father's palazzo, and so I think what I saw, I experienced, I enjoyed to some degree, of course, was visiting the other properties that he had purchased and acquired and assembled as a sort of inheritance that could only hope to add up to, of course, to what he lost. And so I think there is this this constant tension between what we have or don't have, what we want. And I think that certainly in Florence, not only in Florence, but architecture plays a very pivotal role in that. The house stands for so much, and the names, for example, all of a sudden there's the family name, and so the Rucellai acquired a name before they had the palazzo, but that was, to Giovanni Rucellai, that was the one thing missing. Even when he was the third wealthiest man in Florence, he had to have this palace. So, and then I, of course, had to possess it as well, as much as I could. And sometimes believing I had penetrated this space. After all, I had a key to the front door. But by the end of that sabbatical residency, the house had sort of kicked me out, and I was ready to leave as well. It was impossible to fully penetrate that. So there is a lot of anxiety and tension, I think, for everyone moving through this space, whether your name is Rucellai or not. So that was one point. Now, my memory, let's see. I don't know, masculinity. I mean, that's deeply tied to the architecture. And to say something about the women of the family, I think, and what what needs to be rewritten, right? In the tour books or the history books even. I would recommend we rewrite the art history textbooks. You know, in the last 15 years, we've seen an increase in really very interesting scholarship on domesticity, on material culture, on the role of women as patrons, as consumers of visual and material culture. And so we've learned much more about the domestic realm and the power that women could wield within those spaces. And yet with Palazzo Rucellai, those women haven't been written about yet. They are here in this book, but I had very little to draw upon. And it's quite interesting because with Palazzo Rucellai, the story is still dominated by these two alpha males, Giovanni Rucellai and Alberti. And so I think that that more attention, I hope now, will be paid to the women of the family. In large part, we can blame Giovanni because he's the one who wrote them out of his notebook. He wrote them out of the history. So I think that that's one thing that can change our understanding of the house with women in it, and also I think what I'd like to see more of in my own field and beyond is a questioning of these objects that we study so deeply. We tend to study them within a single century or a decade or a year, depending upon the object. But for me, what kept me going in writing this book, it was a 10-year project, what I was so excited by was the afterlife of Palazzo Rucellai. And so it forced me to think about how we write about our objects. And of course, by throwing myself into my object and becoming a part of the story, of course, it was a turning inside out for me, as well as I'm turning the house inside out or upside down. That was also happening in my own life, and so I learned a lot about the house by reflecting upon myself, and vice versa.
Shall we open to a couple of questions from the audience, and maybe anybody has a question?
Sure. I'm not a
Yes,
scholar, but
you need to be a scholar. Everybody's welcome.
I'm a lover of Florence. I
That's-
spent a lot of time there. What happened to the Contessa? My question is, you mentioned the Contessa who rented it to you. How does she figure into the history and the story, in your story?
Yes, so there are a few contessas in the story, but my landlady, yes, she is still there. That was she makes appearances in the book throughout the story. I think she was nothing what I imagined when I moved into the house, so that was sort of my first disappointment. She was my age, and I was expecting matriarch, Florentine matriarch, and but this was the person in the family managing the apartments, and so she, yes, would come to collect the rent. I mean, it is a family home. It is still private. They rent out some of the spaces, but it is still a privately owned home. And so the mail, in fact, does still come for the family, not all of their mail, and they are a presence there. So so she was often there. She doesn't live in Palazzo Rucellai, but she was very visible.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi. I think I can speak loudly enough. How did you, I'm a writer, so how did you evolve into this marvelous, thank you, how did you evolve into this marvelous multi-layered, which so fascinates me, not only you in the house, your personal journey, the house, and then all the ages of the house. That's such an incredibly interesting multi-layered concept.
Thank you. Well, I truly did go to Florence to write a book on tomb sculpture and brought all of those books with me and barely unpacked them. And it wasn't long into my stay when, of course, immediately I became obsessed with the house because it is Palazzo Rucellai. But in speaking with my Florentine friends, with locals, I quite early on heard about this horrific story of the murder. And I was stunned. As an art historian, I thought, this happened in Palazzo Rucellai, and at the time it was only 10 years old, this story. And I thought, wow, how could I not know this? Again, very naively thinking that I knew everything about this house. And that's really what prompted me to start digging, to find out what happened in Palazzo Rucellai beyond the Renaissance. So I did know early on that I wanted to use this format of taking a single site and exploring the life of that building over 600 years, but not as an architectural historian. I'm not trained as such, and I admit I always found it quite boring. I worked on sex and portraits and the fun stuff. But here was this fascinating house, and so I did have to study that architectural history so that I could rewrite it, and I knew that I just had a hunch that there was a really good story here, or probably many, many good stories in this house, and so I set out to unearth those stories. And I wasn't going to put myself in early on, but I was pressured by a very talented literary agent to put myself in the story, and I did, but it took me a long time to find out, really to push the boundaries there and to test my comfort level and to decide how much of myself should go in. And I knew that though I was sometimes uncomfortable with it, I'm not anymore, but I knew that there was a great story there too. How many people besides Stefano here get to live in Palazzo Rucellai? So I knew that had to be part of the story, and I'm really, really glad that I pursued that.
We are glad too. Allison, just one question, then we will go. Because you start with that, and it also connects with something that Sandro mentioned. With you looking at the palazzo from what the little triangle that is not even a piazzetta, is like an accident of poor urban planning, probably, and how disproportionately big the facade is for this narrow street in which it is. So it might have to do with these contradiction, this dialectic between flaunting the huge facade by Alberti and at the same time contrive because they're going to put a huge facade but in such a narrow street where you cannot really fully enjoy the majesty of that facade. So is that sort of dialectic also between the location that was everything, the facade, and the fact that you cannot even fully capture it, contemplate it, admire it?
So, speaking of colonizing the neighborhood and big egos, there was zero piazzetta when Giovanni Rucellai started building the house. And he was very ambitious, that's a polite way of saying it, or very arrogant. And he wasn't satisfied with Alberti's original design, which was a much more compact 5-bay facade. And he wanted his house to be bigger and bigger and bigger. And Alberti advised him against it and said, I wouldn't do that. It's going to ruin the proportion. But he bought another house, and then he had the facade extended. And he was so certain that he was going to acquire the next house that he left the edge of the facade unfinished. So next time you're in Florence, you can see this jagged edge, which to me is so provocative on so many levels. And so I guess as he was waiting to buy the next house, he bought a cousin's house across the street, and because he needed a place for his loggia. So in a very very unusual. The loggia of Palazzo Rucellai is across the street as opposed to in the backyard or on the tip top. And he wanted people to see this facade. He wanted to see the Medici emblems on Palazzo Rucellai and his own personal emblem. And so he also bought other properties only to raise them so that there would be some view. It is a very, very narrow street. And you see the photos are always so awkward because you just can't photograph it. And so as it turns out, the house that he really wanted to buy, that was a cousin owned it. So even within the Rucellai clan, and speaking of envy and jealousy and possessiveness and control, that cousin stipulated in his will that no descendant of his should ever sell this house to the Rucellai. And for 173 years it was upheld. But then finally they acquired it, but at that point they didn't extend the facade. They just put a very, very modest shield on a plain plaster wall, which I think says a lot.
Well, I would like to thank you, Allison, for writing the book, for presenting it here with us, and the incredible panel that brought back to the Casa many dear friends and scholars. Thank you. And there are copies of the book. There are copies of the book for you to purchase upstairs, and Allison will be happy to sign them for you. Thank you again.